A Realm Reborn was a strange time to be an FF14 player, coming off of the successful relaunch of the game after a disastrous initial version. Square Enix were very clearly in damage mitigation mode, attempting to put a bandage on their prior wounds by experimenting heavily with each and every patch, and working their hardest to rapidly expand the game's content library so that it catered to every type of player adequately. New dungeons, 24-man larger scale content, pointed story questing, and the feather in their cap, a high difficulty 8-man raid series, The Binding Coil of Bahamut, based on one of the most important and fearsome adversaries in the game's lore, as well as a truly iconic figure from the overall franchise. 2 raid tiers had come and gone, each with their own dramatics, trials and tribulations alike. The Binding Coil, comprised of turns 1 through 5, had taken 2 months for a victor to be crowned, the product of design decisions, bugs, and lack of experience in part. It was by far the longest raid tier to fall that the game would ever see for the decade plus that was yet to come, and even to this day it's unlikely to ever be beaten. The eventual winners, Blue Garter, a team spread all across the globe, would capitalise on their victory and emerge triumphant in the Second Coil of Bahamut 6 months later as well. They had shown themselves as FF14's dominant force in raiding, and built a respected name recognised by the player base and developers alike. If you want to see how the race to world first for the Binding Coil or Second Coil went, I released a long form video just like this surrounding each, and I'd recommend checking them out. They offer colour, context, and an interesting story to boot. And if you want more long form looks into FF14's past, please do consider subscribing. By all accounts, that sounds like the end of it. The Final Coil would be the next tier and the raiders would move on. The Second Coil is over. But this is not the end of the world race for the Second Coil of Bahamut. This tier is utterly unique in that it had not 1, but 2 races. It was announced that in patch 2.3, set to release on July 8th, 2014, would be accompanied by an experimental challenge mode of the raid, a savage Second Coil. They would tweak the fights, removing any cheese strategies or mechanics they deemed too easy, and tuning in new challenges that only the best of the best would be able to overcome. The same core as the base raid tier, but tuned up to 11. A prestige challenge intended to be tackled in the off patch by the most adept members of the player base. In many ways, the progenitor to current ultimate encounters. Despite being familiar in many ways, in others it was a drastic departure from any raid that would come before or after. There was no requirement to clear in any particular order. Turn 6, 7, 8 and 9 Savage could be tackled in any order. If one battle proved too tough, there was nothing preventing a group from just moving on to another one and coming back later. Information would proliferate very differently due to this, and advantages could easily be gained through carefully choosing the progression order and gaining information from opponents when they eventually posted their clear videos publicly later down the road. Resultingly, the only first that could really matter was the first full clean sweep, the first team to take the win on all 4 turns. Each individual floor would award a title for completion, and given the difficulty in doing so, for the rest of A Realm Reborn would quickly become some of the highest prestige, most respected titles to wear in the game, a sign that their owners overcame adversity. But Second Coil Savage at the time was not seen purely as a positive as its release drew near. The base Second Coil race had only ended a couple of months ago for the world first groups, and for those that were going a little slower, had either barely been completed or were still being progressed. There hadn't been space from the tier for a more difficult release of the same fights to feel fresh. As a result, even amongst Blue Garter players, burnout was a real concern. When Savage tiers were taking weeks to clear for the best of the best, A brand new race just a few months later that promised to be even tougher felt like more of a job than a hobby for many. However, whilst some teams were planning to take a little more relaxed approach with this new difficulty mode, others were eyeing it up as a chance for glory. North American-based team Collision, the team that took world first in turns 6 and 7 before crumbling due to roster issues in the second half of the tier, eventually taking second place. They had reformed, gaining promising new members, and were ready to use Second Coil Savage as a testbed for their eventual Final Coil push. Over on the Japanese data center, Lucrezia was gearing up with the same intent. EU-based Shinra, a hot contender in the early half of Second Coil, had collapsed entirely, with some of their members being absorbed by new team Solitude, whilst others scattered to the wind. There was a key material and frustrating inhibitor that held back progression more than any other though. Second Coil and Second Coil Savage shared a loot lockout. If, for example, a group went in and cleared turn 6, they would not be able to enter turn 6 Savage for the rest of the week. If they went in and cleared turn 6 Savage, they would be locked out of the regular turn 6. But with the differences between FF14's old loot system compared to today's, this limitation became even more archaic. So for context, the way things work today in mid-dawntrail are that if you clear a current tier Savage turn for the week, you are locked out from receiving loot from that turn for the rest of the week, regardless of if you win any drops or not. But you can still go back in and help others as many times as you'd like. They may receive slightly less loot themselves by virtue of you being there, but there is no hard system in place to prevent you from playing more. In A Realm Reborn, this was not the case. If you cleared a turn, you were prohibited from re-entry at all until the next weekly reset. So what often happened is groups would progress as much Savage as they could for the week, then hastily on the last raid of the week, clear the unbeaten turns normal modes in order to get something out of the attempts. Felt unwieldy and annoying to juggle, and the player base as a collective was not a fan. It also made progressing the Savage turns out of order much more difficult, as if, for example, a group decided to do T9 Savage before T8 Savage, and they cleared, they would be locked out of attempting any other turn until the next week. Many believed that Savage should either operate on a separate lockout or be exempt from one entirely. As a result, when release came around, this race took a vastly different tone. Many groups treated it as a long-term project, one to pace themselves on and tackle at their leisure, rather than booking time away from their lives to commit to fully. More than anything, they were interested to see whether this experimental content would pay off. On release, it was clear that each and every encounter had taken preventative steps to the solo tank meta that had begun to emerge, adding vulnerabilities after tank busters and forced swaps, or designing them carefully to make them much more difficult to overcome without fielding 2 tanks. Square Enix wanted the standard full party composition to stick in their pinnacle encounters. That much was obvious. Damage and health values were bumped up in an attempt to make the execution requirements even tighter. Rafflesia's encounter was intentionally designed to make any final phase cheeses invalid. Swarm, too, was reworked. A mechanic with barely any impact in the original had been transformed into a real threat for the Savage variant. This time it functioned somewhat similarly to Allagan Rot, placing 4 stacks on a random player and needing to be shared via contact to others to prevent its pain from being fatal. In Savage, most of the mechanics begin right away as well, intersecting with one another throughout so that the party has to juggle everything persistently from start to end. One common strategy was to tank the boss in the middle, alleviating positioning requirements from the bulbs, and this too was made near enough impossible. Moving onwards to turn 7, Melusine was made even more menacing than ever before. The number of Renauds in play doubled with 2 at once, forcing either multiple players to handle them, while those assigned kiters to work overtime. Their speed was increased, and whereas before they could be repeatedly turned to stone, this time around the party could only do it one single time before they became immune. In a similar fashion, there would be more cursed shrieks at once, as well as 2 cursed voices. The complexity as a result far increased, and this was rapidly seen by many as one of, if not the outright toughest Savage flaw. It required adjustment, careful positioning, and constant juggling of a number of deadly moving parts. Just like Rafflesia, many of the elements presented themselves from the very beginning, with no slow build-up that many had taken for granted in the easier difficulty. When it came to turn 8 Savage, towers would spawn at random locations. Rather than simple memorization being acceptable like in the normal, players had to learn the icons and adapt accordingly. Dreadnoughts had to be tanked separately from the boss, or they would cause an immediate raid wipe, immediately scuppering an oversight that had made the solo tank strategies so prevalent in the early days of Avatar's release. A new tower entirely was added to further complicate the core challenge, one which reduced maximum HP, which in tandem with the other effects and Allegan Field, which now spawned on 2 players at times rather than 1, made it a tight test of timing and mitigation. More mines, more homing missile hits, and more pain. Despite that, this iteration of Turn 8 was incredibly satisfying to pull off, and was considered by many to be the best implementation of a harder version of one of the raids at the time. Turn 9 in many ways resembled its original state quite closely. The Tank Buster forced a tank swap, which was a persistent change throughout the tier. The Mario Kart method that had shot up to prevalence as a cheese for the meteors had been intentionally prevented by tuning the timing at which the first meteors would crash into the ground. Mechanical rotations in the final phase would be capped off by Mega Flare raid wides, and the final phase in general added components, including more supernovas, comets during dive bombs and Heaven's Fall, double the thunder spreads at once, and faster meteor stream spreads. The general consensus fairly quickly was that Turn 6 and 9 were a simple enough step up from their original iterations, whilst Turns 7 and 8 were incredibly difficult and far surpassed anything in the game thus far, challenge-wise. So, groups got to work. On July 9th, Lucrezia downed Turn 6 Savage, dispatching the Death Flower for good, and 2 hours later Collision followed suit. Blue Garter defeated the boss on July 11th, and many other groups that had cleared the base tier claimed the title of Rafflesia Reaper for their own as the week would go on. 6 days after that, Lucrezia would continue to display their dominance, downing Melusine and unlocking the Melusine Mauler title, one which would take even other top groups a lot longer to pull off with their non-hardcore schedules. Turn 8 would take much longer, upwards of an additional week, thanks to the nature of the Avatar's mechanics and how punishing it was to lose focus on, even for a moment. But in the tail end of July, Lucrezia locked in their clear, as well as their title, and others followed shortly after. On August 10th, just over a month after the release of Second Coil Savage, they became the first group to complete the sweep. Upon clearing Nail Savage and claiming the Demeter or Demetrix title depending on player gender, Lucrezia locked their place in the annals of FF14 history. With this under their belt, they would be a real threat in the future, one that was poised to wrestle directly with Blue Garter for the throne, and the title of World First in A Realm Reborn's final raid tier, set to release just a few months down the line. The Japanese roster was ready, and they couldn't wait to put all they had learned here to the test. But aside from allowing Lucrezia a chance to shine as they hadn't before, the Savage Coils served another purpose entirely. They acted as the catalyst to exponentially push forward player improvement, and raiders became better as a direct result. The next race would be more competitive than ever before, as those forged in the crucible of Savage Coil would be ready and waiting to go harder than ever. It was a unique experiment, one which in many ways had paid off and added to the game meaningfully, and in others had come at the wrong time and place to be truly appreciated by those who might enjoy it the most. That sentiment marks much of A Realm Reborn's life cycle. Experimentation, both in success and failure, in an attempt to position Final Fantasy XIV as a game with the mettle to succeed and truly exit the shadow of 1.0's failure. By patch 2.3, where this video ends, it's fair to say that these tentative steps had done a world of difference for the goodwill that players felt towards the juvenile MMO. The future was bright as the final coil loomed. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you made it all the way to the end, I really appreciate it. I have a Patreon. You don't need to support it, but if you do, it will allow me to keep uploading here more regularly. If you want to see the uncut version of my conversation with Tyreth and Caraway, it's available exclusively there, as well as any pre-release excerpts that I put up. The people on screen now are the reason I was able to make this one, and I'm greatly appreciative. If you do sign up, I add pre-release materials for future videos, as well as some exclusive content, and you'll be included in the credits of future videos. And of course, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.